We're in the boardroom of the New York Historical Society today, and I'm talking to Professor Elaine May. Elaine Tyler May is professor of history at the University of Minnesota, and she's also the leading expert on women in the Cold War era, which is the period that we're going to focus on right now. Professor May, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So I want to start by asking you the question that puzzles a lot of historians of women. We come out of World War II with a very exciting sort of sense that women have done their bit, can do anything, can live new lives, and so on. And then we enter the Cold War period in the late 40s and early 1950s, and suddenly women are right back in their homes. Can you, in 2 sentences, explain to us what happened there?
Well, I think one way to look at it is to realize that the war, as wartime often does, created tremendous upheaval at home, as well as sending millions of men abroad to fight the war. And what often happens, as it happened in World War I, women filled in where they were needed. And if you add to that fact that prior to the war, we had a deep economic depression in this country, which also forced women to take on jobs that they hadn't previously filled. They were mostly what we think of as women's work. But nonetheless, they left their homes to enter the paid labor force, whether or not they were married, whether or not they had children, because it was absolutely necessary for them and their families to survive during the Depression. But many people, including people within the families as well as social leaders, considered that work of women to be emergency work, only because it was a crisis, first the Depression and then the war, and that afterwards things would settle back down and women would take their place again at home. And during the war, this was a message that was very powerfully driven home, in a way, to women, that they should be prepared to take back their domestic duties and make room for the returning veterans.
Right, we've seen that when we've looked at Rosie, the riveter materials. But if I can push you a little bit on this, when I look at the statistics of women working, I notice that by the middle of the 1950s, there's about the same proportion of women in the wage labor force as there were at the height of the wartime experience. And yet, in the wartime experience, there seemed to be a kind of enthusiasm as women entered, to be sure, women's jobs, but also many men's jobs. We've looked at some of them, for example, at the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
Right.
But in the middle of the 1950s, at least I don't hear those large numbers of women, including married women, who go back into the labor force. I don't hear them expressing enthusiasm about their work so much as I hear them expressing enthusiasm about what they can contribute to the families. Am I hearing the right thing there, or?
Absolutely. There is really, as you pointed out, there's really no decline in the proportion of women who are in the paid labor force after the war. What is different is that the kinds of jobs that had previously been considered men's jobs were given back to the men, and the women were dismissed from those jobs. So they were pushed into what we thought of at the time as women's work, not as well paid, not as many opportunities for advancement. And for many women themselves, with the powerful domestic ideology that emerged very quickly after the war, many of those working women said, yes, I have a job, but my career, they used that word career, as a wife and mother or as a homemaker. And these were also years when the science, if you will, of homemaking was rising to give especially educated women a sense that their work in the home mattered, that it was important, that it was highly skilled, and that it was a profession in itself.
So can we talk about that in two separate categories? Can we talk first about the domestic ideology and what was that? I mean, we've seen domestic ideologies in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but how would you define the domestic ideology in the post-war period?
Well, that was one of the things that really puzzled me when I started this work, because it seemed strange that after all of the advances throughout the 20th century, that you would get to the moment after World War II when women had really blossomed during the war and taken on all kinds of many, not only employment and career opportunities, but just public life. That why after World War II suddenly did we get something that ideologically looked more like the Victorian era, more like the 19th century? And I think there were two pieces to that. One was a backward look to a time when some people felt that the world was more stable. And at the moment of the Cold War, when the world seemed very unstable and frightening, the vision of a stable domestic order with women in the home taking care of everything in the family and men as the breadwinners felt like it was a way to create a certain kind of well-known, understandable social order. On the other hand, it was also forward-looking, because the new home, the new family, was a much more, at least in the vision that it represented, it was more prosperous, because of course there was a lot more prosperity after World War II than before. It was much more technologically advanced. You had all kinds of appliances and so-called labor-saving devices available in the home to ease women's domestic chores. What we know now is that those appliances and other kinds of so-called labor-saving devices really just raised the expectations and heightened the standards for domestic work for women, and that women were laboring very many long hours. The kinds of expectations for child rearing and nurture, the kinds of expectation for domestic cleanliness and teaching, not teaching, scratch that, domestic cleanliness, cooking, other kinds of domestic chores were elevated to a new level of expectation.
And that brings us smoothly into the second part of the question that I was going to ask you, which is the material conditions of women's work in the home. You would think that all these labor-saving devices that you've mentioned would make their lives easier and enable them to go out to work, and instead they seem to pull women into the home even more. Can you explain that seeming paradox?
Well, it wouldn't have had to have been a paradox if, in fact, there had been opportunities for women in the paid labor force to expand their horizons and their activities. But the opportunities for women in the paid labor force shrank into a narrower realm than had been true during the war, or even in some of the professions earlier than that. The professional schools and graduate programs began to limit the numbers of women or exclude them altogether. The sense was after the war that the really important thing to do was to make sure that men had jobs that were well paid, well enough paid that they could support a family, that they wouldn't come back from the war and find that they were facing another depression. There were great fears that there would be another depression after World War II. Of course, that didn't happen. There was tremendous prosperity compared to the years leading up to the war. But at the time, people didn't know that that would be the case. Then many feared that with the end of the war and the wartime economy, that the economy would crash again.
And of course, there was the Korean War, which began in the early 1950s and lasted for 3 years. We never sort of incorporated it as a war, but it surely drew men into the labor force and then women into the labor force and increased the the demand for consumer goods even as it did so.
Exactly, not to mention what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. On some level, the Cold War was a means for continuing the wartime economy, and the munitions industries all through the post-war era and up until today, really, that the arms manufacturing and the defense industries just continued to grow. They didn't diminish because the pressures of the Cold War and the atomic age and the nuclear arms race kept those industries thriving, kept men employed, and a number of women as well.
Yeah. So, and fueled prosperity.
Of course.
So are you saying that there's a link between Cold War containment and military buildup and consumer prosperity?
Well, I think that we can't really segment people's lives at this time, or really any time, if we accept a kind of false dichotomy between private life and public life, between the paid economy and the unpaid economy, as if these are really separate realms of human endeavor, then I think we miss important connections. And certainly in the years after World War II, the ideas that fueled the Cold War and the Cold War economy also fueled the domestic ideology and the arrangements of gender both in the home and in the workforce.